So with that, I'm going to introduce our next keynote speaker, who is Chris Perkins, who actually traveled from Austin, Texas last night to be with us. He is a partner at WPA Opinion Research, and he runs the firm's Texas office in Austin. In 2013, the American Association of Political Consultants awarded Perkins and WPA with a Polly Award for the best polling technique for a successful U.S. Senate election. Perkins is an expert in quantitative and qualitative analysis, having conducted and analyzed survey data for over a decade on behalf of Republican candidates and numerous corporate and trade association clients. Please give Chris a warm welcome.
Thanks, Brian. Thank you. All right, let's see if this clicker's working. And yeah, thank you for having me. Thank you for the council for having me to talk about a little bit about polling, survey research, how it's done, how it's utilized, and no, I do not work for Donald Trump. So before anybody asks. But again, thank you very much. A lot of you, I'm sure everybody in this room sees a poll. This poll says this poll says that on television, and how is it used? Now, what I want to go through you today is how it's used from an internal value, rather than what you're seeing on television. I mean, what you see on television has very little internal data as it relates to what it's actually being used for. The purpose of those type of polls is to generate news, and so a news outlet will use basically the cheapest means to get a story. But for this purpose, some of you probably already know a lot about survey research. How is it used, and what is it that it actually does? How do you use the data from a survey standpoint to develop it? And so what I'll show you it from a standpoint of how it relates in a political campaign. So for this purpose, I'll show you basically the way it works on a political campaign side, although you can use it for market research, customer satisfaction, how do you grow your company base, corporate base, and in general branding as well. But for this purpose, I'll show you from a standpoint of how is it used from a political perspective. So polling, what is polling? What does it do, and what's the purpose of it? The purpose is basically what I say, the polling is the hub that helps inform and enhance every other elements of your entire, in this case, campaign effort. So it is going to enhance the narrative, the general message of a campaign that you want to put out, at least from a political standpoint. What is the general narrative, and how is it built, and what can you do with it? Polling, survey research enhances what that is. It also is going to be the hub and the means for enhancement of voter contact. Messages for television, radio, mail, digital, whatever means of contact that you intend to use in a political sense, polling is going to help you understand what it is that you need to be saying. How do you affect human behavior or voter behavior with your communication efforts? It is also targeting and persuasion. Survey research is also going to be able to show you what areas of the electorate that you need to target, what type of people are going to form, in a political sense, the winning coalition, in a non-political sense, a customer base. Where's your market, and how can you enhance it? What do you need to be saying to persuade them, to target some demographics and then persuade other demographics? And then, as I call it, GOTV, mobilization plan. GOTV is the political term for get out the vote. Whom is it in a political sense that you need to turn out? There is always, from a political standpoint, those that you absolutely know are on your side. They are going to be with you regardless of how terrible the candidate it looks on stage or what awful thing he or she says. They're always going to be in your corner. How is it that you need to turn them out? From a political standpoint, you need those people to vote. And the survey research is going to help you understand where they are and how you motivate them to turn out. And then fundraising and institutional support building, I'll glance over that in a little bit later. But essentially from a standpoint of if you are, from a political standpoint, obviously the way you need to fund your effort is through donors, is through money. How can polling be utilized to enhance that effort. How does that work? So I'll go over each one of these in general. So the narrative. So the idea that you're going to build a narrative around your political effort, what is it that you need to say? And it basically is the idea of forming a narrative. And research has provided, the old axiom is true, you never get a second chance to make a first impression. So from a political standpoint, before you get out front and say, okay, I'm running for X office, you need to have survey research behind you to understand what it is that you're going to say. Because that is the one day in the entire news cycle that you are going to have the floor. There is, whatever you say is going to get printed, it's going to get covered, and it is the one day in the entire campaign effort that you can basically dictate and write the story on your own. So if you miss an opportunity to understand what it is about your target market, in this case voters, that what they want to hear and how you're going to talk about it, you've wasted a major opportunity to start developing your overall narrative. And the way we basically show this is, getting the story right is the most important thing you do, and the time frame in which you basically set the stage, voters have a means of kind of, the more you say it to it, the drop-off is. It doesn't mean you want to stop saying it, but there is a drop-off on a means of how they're consuming the information. So it is very important to establish your general narrative on what you're going to say before you ever do it. And our survey research allows that to happen. If you're conducting survey research, you're going to be able to understand what it is, what type of issues, and what type of subgroups of voters you need to motivate and communicate to. So, the other side of that is, okay, you've built a narrative. So you understand kind of from a macro standpoint what it is that you need to be saying. So from a macro standpoint. Then it's time to understand, how do you use survey research to understand what it is about the multitude of messages. If you've ever, I'm sure everybody has followed at least one political campaign in their life, there's always the general means of you're going to have a lot of different things come your way. This issue, that issue, this issue, that issue. There's a big, I remember when I first started getting into this, I'll date myself, the biggest issue in what would be the 2000 campaign, so we're looking back 15 years, which actually started more in 99, was Y2K. Huge issue. It was going to be this big issue, and then it came around and it was absolutely nothing. I mean, there was no way that it was going to motivate anybody, but the media built up Y2K as it being a massive issue that was going to influence all these voters, and it was absolutely nothing. However, we need to understand how big of a deal that is from a survey research standpoint. What the media tends to promote and what is out there, especially things that they get behind, isn't always what's going to move voters or how you're going to influence voting behavior. So the idea is we want to understand the story of our campaign centered around an issue. We're going to know generally about that from the narrative, but we want to start breaking it into into other subgroups of issues and things that are going to come up. And the same issue in your opponent's words, to understand what it is about each individual issue that's going to move. So the idea here is we understand what our big theme is. We've got a theme from a macro standpoint, but there are a lot of things that the candidate will want to say, but the idea that you're going to be able to say all of these things to the number of groups is not feasible. I mean, if you've ever worked with a political candidate, there's probably 15 to 25 things that they actually want to accomplish. But honestly, you're only going to get maybe 2 or 3 of those to actually work with the electorate. So what we'll utilize is a message regression standpoint. This is basically the idea here is we want to measure the effectiveness and stickiness, so how effective is the message and how memorable is the message from using a regression analysis. And that is the idea of testing certain messages, testing all of them as a block through survey research, using a regression analysis to understand how it is people move. And that is the understanding of each particular message. Do I have a little thingy here? Let's see. Yeah, look at that. So basically, this is only 5 of them, so this is a scaled down version. Usually we're going to go ahead and run a dozen, somewhere between 12 to 16 different types of messages using the analysis to come by. I mean, and basically you can see on this chart, we've basically out of 5 got 3 of them that are neutral or don't really have that much impact from a coefficient standpoint. But then you've got 2 over here, the farther to the right it is, the more effective it is, which means the regression coefficient is larger, that have real movement. And so that is the idea of targeting these voters using the exact messages that we picked up from the survey and not getting distracted with what the media wants to talk about. You always want to use the survey analysis to understand what you did and what you understand is the message and continue to harp on that versus what the media wants to talk about. Now, a lot of political candidates get caught up in what the media wants to talk about, and they're missing huge opportunities because they're not talking about what the voters want to hear, your market. So that is the idea about understanding the way it's used to understand how you're going to put together a message to target to voters. And in this type of survey, what we're also going to do is understand the message. We want to know 4 different things. We want to know 4 different ways on how we're going to understand messaging. 1, that's the messages about you. So your candidate, a candidate for X office, let's just say president, wants to understand what it is, the messages about him or her that are going to work. We also want to know the same thing, the messages about our opponents. So what are the opponents going to say about themselves that we need to understand that's going to motivate the voters? So survey research is going to help us understand not only what's going to work with our side, but what's going to work with our opponent's side. And we need to understand exactly what it is that he or she is going to say on the other end that's going to work, and the other things that are not going to work. And obviously in political campaigns, you're going to naturally be attacked, sometimes in very, very, very public fashions. A good survey research, you understand that before it hits. So in this type of survey, we also want to test things about us that are bad. Things that we believe, and hopefully we've done pretty substantial research on ourselves to understand every one of the possible pitfalls, and we need to understand which one of these is going to actually have impact. In most cases, that you see actually the negative things that come out have very little impact. The voters actually don't tend to move on most negative pieces of information. There's usually maybe only 1 or 2 out of a whole swath that will have impact, but a lot of times you'll see candidates, especially on the political side, get caught up in, oh my gosh, that person said something mean about me, I've got to respond. Well, you don't want to respond to things that don't work. And the survey research is going to tell us these things you need to leave alone. When somebody comes out and attacks you on, your vote on, I don't know, spending or whatever it is that you did, that's not going to work. This will have no impact with the electorate. So when that person says it, leave it alone. A lot of times that's candidate discipline too, but at least from a survey research standpoint, we understand on polling which one of them are going to have impact and which ones deserve a response. And we also want to do the same thing about the other side. We want to know, okay, the opponents have vulnerabilities. Which one of these can we use against them when the opportunity is right? What are the things that we need to contrast our positive and their negative information with to develop that level of contrast? And because it's also what I was just talking about, negative information on your own side. You don't want to put negative information out on the other side that you know is not going to have an impact. Because in a political campaign, it tends to backfire. If there is no direct impact, that you will see some serious backlash in your face. So the survey research is going to help us understand which one of the contrast pieces on our opponent we can actually use versus ones we should not be using. And then that's also overcoming the message. So we've in this type of survey, in this type of poll, we're starting to understand a lot. We know the general, what we'll call macro narrative. We also understand the elements of what we're going to utilize in driving more of a micro level message. We also know what stumbling blocks we have and how to overcome them, and the same thing with the opponents. And we want to let me back up. We want to understand what things that we can put out if we see a stumbling block. So if we see a message that we know we're vulnerable on, what is it that we need to put out in front of the voters that what is what I always say, soften the blow? I mean, the way I always explain it when I'm dealing with a candidate is I'll show them the little map and I'll say, okay, that message that's negative on you, that's going to sting. So when we're hit with this, we're going to take a direct punch. But what we can also understand is off of that message, what are the positive elements about us that move voting behavior to the same group of people that moved off us with a certain hit. So we want to take essentially that variable of people that we notice that, oh, we're going to take a punch with this message, and which one of the positive messages that we saw can we start putting out publicly to soften the blow. Sometimes it's not always the general narrative. Sometimes it's very, very some things that overall don't work, but we want to make sure that we're softening the blow by feeding the voters that level of information to say, okay, when this punch comes, we won't take it in the chin. We'll take it on the cheek, but not the chin. It won't knock us out if we can soften the blow earlier. So it's an understanding of what we need to be putting out earlier before the punch comes. So that is a major way. It's what in industry terms, we call that a benchmark, the benchmark survey. The benchmark poll is a full understanding of each one of our messages. What are we going to say? What are the opponents going to say? What are they going to say about us? And what can we say about them? And a full means of understanding how do we use this data to set the tone and start messaging to voters. It's very important in the political campaigns. Then what we're going to start doing, we've got an understanding of the message. We need what survey research is done and what polling is used for is, you've seen on television the head-to-head, but really what we're trying to understand as we get into the micro level are which subgroups of voters do we need to communicate with. Our data is going to be able to show you, okay, in this case, we're using, do we want to go to Sean Hannity's Great Americas, which is the the hard right, or do we need to go to the Bourgeois Bohemians, which is the far left? Usually you don't need one of those two. It's kind of a joke. We want to go somewhere in the middle. But it's the idea of understanding which pieces of the electorate do we need to communicate with to build a winning coalition. And our polling is going to be able to show you and say, hey, here's what we need. We need these segments of the electorate. If we want to get to 50 plus 1 percentage points, basically we want to win, here is where we need to understand the people from these types of voters. We need these types of voters to be in our corner, and that would be what our communication efforts are being led to. It's not always what the media says. They like to suggest, oh, here's who's in play, here's who this, in a very macro level, but we need a fine-tuned understanding of whom we know we have and whom we need to be communicate with, whether that's the hard right or the hard left. Somewhere in between is actually the voting groups that we're looking for. And then our survey research is also going to help understand the persuasion targets. So we've utilized our data and our survey research to build what we call the winning coalition. These are the types of voters that we need to persuade and talk to and motivate. And where are they? What type of people are they? Are they, if you're looking at a more conservative side, and those are the people that we need, we need to look at Fox News viewers versus non-Fox viewers versus ABC versus non-English speaking Hispanic language channels. So this becomes a means of, okay, we understand these subgroups. Where is it that we need to communicate with them? What median is it? What particular area is it? Is it cable television? Is it broadcast? Is it digital? Where is it that we need to be communicating to these voters? And our survey research is going to tell you, okay, your coalition is built off these types of voters. And here is where they gather their information, and here is where you need to be targeting them. That changes a lot too. I mean, through the course of a campaign, we see a lot of not necessarily decision making, but information consumption changing a lot. So this is a thing that we need to continuously adjust and be open to. It's not necessarily always, the old way of doing political campaigns is you go up and throw something on broadcast news during the news hour and you see numbers move. I mean, that's still, you can still see that, but it moves slower because of the various means of communication and information that especially in here, a lot of us receive that, I don't watch the news. I don't know how many other people do. I'm sure there's a few of us, but that's also changing. So we need to be able to adjust on the fly to understand where voters are getting their communication, and our polling is going to be able to tell us where to go, at least to be able to set the stage of where we should be communicating with the voters from. And then also what it does is, I said, the GOTV, getting out our vote. It helps us understand. Our survey and our polling is going to help us understand who do we need to turn out. In this case, basically what we see is, we'll call it independent men between the ages of 45 and 54. So nonpartisan middle-aged men becomes a group that we see in our polling that says, these people are with us. There's really not going to be much that the other side can do to turn them. And so we need to start turning them out. So at the end, we're going to start using polling to understand the ballot total. If we're trying to get the 50 plus 1 and only 15% of them are turned out, we need to start upping that number. And so it's the idea of saying, okay, here is the percentage of, in this case, independent middle-aged men that have turned out. We need more of them to go. And so that helps enhance the efforts to go find them. Who are the ones that haven't turned out yet? Where are the other places that we need to go to get them? What's the percentage that we need to turn out to achieve the level? In this case, we started off with 15, and we got it just within 3 days to 18, and we can continue to build that percentage. And then also, at the end of the game, it's called, I'm sure you've heard it, I think Gallup calls it tracking polling. I think they're the only one that still calls it that. It's the industry term to track the electorates. So at the end, we are going to see, what we want to do is watch trend lines. So, here's the idea here. This is Evans. So if you're in blue and you're Evans, and we see, okay, we started off with a 7-point lead, but now we're at a 2-point deficit. That's what we call a bad trend, and we want to know about that beforehand. We want to be able to watch the trend lines, because from a standpoint of developing a political strategy and developing the in-game strategy, especially off the tracking survey data, we want to be understanding where we're going. We want to see a trend line like this yellow. We want to see this continuously going up. And what it does at the end, it tells us it tells us where we're going and how we need to adjust in real time. The failed campaign efforts tend to not do this. They will just say, okay, I don't want to spend the money. We really need it to go into more radio. I think we're good. We don't need the data anymore. And then a lot of times the trend goes down and they never know about it. And so that's the idea with understanding where we are heading almost on a nightly basis to develop some sort of trend. And if the trend's going the wrong way, we need to understand why, and we need to get on it very, very quick. Now, a lot of times you're not going to see us go upside down. A good trend is when you are up 7 and then you go up, and then you're only up 5, and you need to catch it before you actually go down. Because once you start a snowball effort, when you go beneath if you start out with a lead and go beneath the opponent, a lot of times you can never catch up. So polling is going to be able to help us stop. We're going to catch the trend before we go what's called upside down, to be able to attack that and what we're going to be able to do to turn it. And it monitors everything. I mean, basically what we're doing on a nightly basis is we're taking our data and we are monitoring every single element from a name ID standpoint. I mean, a lot of candidates, start out with only about half the electorate ever hearing about it, and then we're up to 81. Well, 81's good, but we need to be at 99. We need to make sure everybody's hearing about it. So it's tracking our what we call name ID, our brand, what's the percentage of the voters that identify us and who doesn't know about us yet. It's tracking those who have a favorable opinion and an unfavorable opinion about us. So based on the information that's out there, we want to understand what our name identification is, what our favorable percentage is, and what our unfavorable percentage is, and which elements of the electorate are the favorables and the unfavorables going in. And that's also That's also a good way to understand if you see unfavorables come up overnight and the media buyer didn't catch a spot on television. It's not necessarily always the case. Did a digital effort hit with a certain demographic group that we never saw? And then we got to go find out what it is. And we can get that in basically a single day or less if we're utilizing the polling to understand it. And then also, kind of the last point, you use survey data from a standpoint of fundraising. You're a political campaign. You can't do it on your own. Regardless of how good your message is and how awesome of a candidate he or she is or you are, you're not going to be able to win unless you can raise money. And most of the what we'll call major donors who are very sophisticated and do want to see some side of internal polling to say, okay, before we give you money, show me your path to victory. And a lot of times, the path, people get scared about taking their polling into a potential donor pitch because you're losing by 20. You say, okay, our polling says we're getting killed. But that's not necessarily always a bad thing. If you tell them, hey, we're down by 20, but here's what we found out. We found out these 3 messages move numbers. So what we start off with down 20, we actually increase to +5. But we need your help getting out that message. We're going to stay at down 20, and we'll never achieve +5 if you don't support us, because the money actually helps get out that message. And so donors want to see the type of way, they want to see that you've got a plan. And so your survey research, your polling is going to be able to show, okay, look, we're losing by 20, but our path to victory is on these 3 messages, because that changes the whole dynamic of the race. But without you, Mr. and Mrs. Donor, I'm never going to get there. And so it also is a good sales pitch. Fundraising is also, from a national side, driven off a lot of the national polls. Us internal pollsters and data research analysts don't necessarily like what Fox and CNN and Washington Post and all these people are putting out, but it's the nature of the game, and donors do react off those type of polls. So a lot of it is, Mr. or Mrs. Donor will call and say, hey, I saw us, we were up 5 one day and now we're only up 2. And it becomes an explanation of, here's what our internals show. And note, a 5 to 2 point difference is still margin of error. Okay, and then they kind of get it. So it's a little bit of a nuisance on our end, but it is something that is definitely, we need to be ready for, to be able to show them the internal side to say, okay, even though it's not that much different from a top line perspective of what the national, Washington Post poll is saying, we still have a more sophisticated means of how we're changing numbers and moving the electorate than what the Post puts out. I'm going to skip that and show you basically and here is the idea and how good polling, good survey research is used from a political perspective. We call it the reverse pyramid. So in a traditional political campaign, from an expenditure side of what the campaign is actually spending resources on, the early stages of the campaign are very little. The early stages of the campaign, of any good political campaign, are what we call initial outreach, developing more of a grassroots effort and raising dollars from donors. So the spending on the campaign side at the earliest stages from a macro standpoint is very low. As we start going, we need to start, so it's low, and as a campaign starts going, they're going to start paying for voter contact, whether that's TV, whether that's radio, whether that's mail, whether that's phones, whether that's digital, whether that's block walking and targeting. All of that is going to commence and will cost more money. So at that stage, the campaign's resources are starting to spend, and then as we get late in the game, they're basically just trying to dump the bank account. Not only continuing with the media and the voter contact means, but also trying to turn their people out. We're going to spend a ton of money on the ground to start moving these voters to the polls. Polling works in reverse. We want to know the good polling. We need to understand all of it early. We need to, the most costly side of the survey research and the polling is done between the narrative and the benchmark side. So at the beginning, the expenditures from the survey side are the highest. And that is the idea is before we even get to this phase right here, we've got to understand. The data is going to be telling us what our messaging is before we can even start spending money with these voters. So it works in reverse, and at the end, it's relatively inexpensive, and all we're doing is just tracking, reporting, turning out, tracking, reporting, turning out. And so the good survey research and good data from a polling side, actually from a campaign side, works in reverse. You spend more money at the beginning than you do the end on internal polling, which is also something that a lot of the news people don't quite understand. But I'm glad they don't. That's okay with me. And so, and the idea here, I always say that the question to ask the pollster, if the pollster, well, let me back up. Here's what you want to say. How are voters in this case, district, going to make their decisions? From a data standpoint, if a pollster is only just doing the data side, hey, we've got data and we're going to report it, that is not of value to the campaign. That is necessary component to the campaign, but a good pollster is going to be able to accurately tell you how voters are going to make their decisions. Not necessarily, okay, I can give you some data and we can macro target and we can micro target and we can utilize this data. We need all that. That should be pretty standard. But what a question to ask is how are voters going to make the decision? What is it about the electorate that we need to understand from a decision-making side? Because polls, from a political side, move all the time. I mean, even just within the last month, if you've seen kind of whether it's the Democratic primary or the Republican primary, you can see numbers shifting all over the place. And how are voters going to make their decision on the day of the electorate? And that becomes the more valuable side. Yes, the data reporting part is necessary, and we absolutely have to have that. But you can only have that at the end if you've got a decision-making side and a messaging side at the front end. If you don't have that, all of the other, you can have the best data team in the world, and it ain't going to matter because you don't have a message. You basically don't have anything to sell to the voters. No. That is, I know I've run you through a lot of things about polling. Some of you probably first time you've heard of what survey research can do. I'm sure a few of you in here are experts on that stuff. I know it's a ton of information I just went through, at least on the political side. But what's on your mind? What questions, thoughts, anything do you have? Yes, sir.
As more and more candidates hire people like you.
Yeah.
As more and more. Is that on? Yeah.
Yeah.
As more and more candidates hire people like you and gain deeper knowledge into similar demographics, so let's say moderate voters, 30 to 45 years of age. Have you found that over the years, kind of messaging is normalized? Are you seeing more of the same types of messages from various candidates because they're all targeting the same people that they know more about?
Yeah.
And if that's the case, how do you, as someone working for a single candidate, overcome kind of that normalization of messaging?
Yeah. Well, the messaging does change quite a bit. That's an interesting question because there is the general concept, especially on a national level, that in the end, that what we'll say call moderate, independent, swing voters, whatever kind of bucket you want to put them on, tend to vote with their pocketbook. The economy is good, they're going to vote for the incumbent. The economy's bad, they're going to vote against the incumbent. That's the traditional means of it, but it's not necessarily that simple. There is a lot of different issues. An economic message is always very standard. You're always going to be able to talk some level of an economic message with that swing voter, but the areas around it to make that impactful change a ton. Today, it's ISIS and national security. 4 years ago, nobody knew what the heck that was. 4 years ago, it was climate change. And so it is a totally different game on how you make that, what it will eventually be your economic impact, your economic message, work. What is it that you can start setting the stage with? And it changes like crazy. And that's the side that we have to understand on the survey research side. What is it about these messages? How can we make this eventual economic message that we want to go to moderate independence with more impactful. Because if you start with the wrong message, they're never going to hear you. They're never going to hear you out on the economic side. So it's the components around it that change quite a bit. Yes, sir.
Do you think we'll ever find a time where we'll take the data that we track, now that we're talking about voting and election, to determine who we put in there based on what they did, since we have all that data available?
Based on what they did. Yes. I mean, a lot of the way our industry is changing is we are taking a lot of what we understand just from the survey side and putting them into, well, let me back up. From a poll has a small sample size. So let's hypothetically say you're looking at the state of Pennsylvania. So the state of Pennsylvania, we're only going to poll about 1,000 people statewide. 1,000 people is not enough to be able to develop a database, like you said, to understand each individual voter, but it's good to understand it from a macro side. You're raising your hand. Oh, okay.
Instead of, like right now you're talking about looking at ISIS or whatever it is, and it was climate change before.
Yeah.
I believe we had to know some of that stuff with all our informational stuff. But do you think it will come a time when we actually just look at whatever the issues are, because we have data on all of it, and who should we best put in the office to address those issues? Based on what they've done before, not based on all the other stuff we're talking about.
That is very simplistic.
I'm trying to keep it simple on purpose, actually.
I mean, the PC answer is, yeah, absolutely. We're always going to be able to put in the best person based on an issue, but that's not how it works. Okay, yeah.
Sorry.
Can you talk about how the tools have changed?
Tools.
From the early 90s of doing paper polls,
Oh,
and
yeah.
using SPSS and running it on 2 desktops to mobile devices and tablets
Yes.
and application of emerging technologies like social media listening and social media platforms.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, it's changed. I mean, even in our industry, it's changed drastically just over the past, I'll call it 6 years. Because, used to it was, polling was you only dialed landlines, you weighted it, you applied a mathematical weight to demographics you couldn't mesh, you printed crosstabs off a dot matrix printer, and that was it. So it's evolved from that to today. We are having to utilize cell phone only households like crazy. And unfortunately, on the Republican side, most of what I'll call my competitors are just figuring that out. Thankfully, we've, at least from our side, because we're a bit on the younger side of our industry, have been doing that for roughly 6 to 8 years now. And it's verified. I think I just saw Pew's data that came out yesterday. 47% of Americans are cell phone only households now. For those that don't know, when you're using polling, it is a federal crime to dial a cell phone. You cannot do that. You cannot use the dialer system that dials a cell phone. It's a crime. So you have to hand dial every single cell phone to be able to conduct a poll, which is harder and more costly and takes longer. Well, a good firm will already have that infrastructure in place to be able to do that. But yes, it's changed dramatically from the means of how we reach them, going from landline waits to now having to do cell phone samples and being able to track that demographic element. The other side that it's changed is we've become a lot more analytical. I mean, used to, like we were talking about, you were saying in the early 90s, you just printed off dot matrix and you just kind of read off the data and circle the crosstabs that are meaningful. We need to have a better understanding of the underlying data on how voters are making their decision because of the means that messaging gets out so much quicker. I mean, back in the days, it was the idea that, we found some dirt on the opponent, it's going to take a day or two to hit. Today, it's tweeted, it's on the air within seconds. And so we need to understand exactly from a data analytics standpoint of how voters are getting their information. So the industry has changed from basically taking traditional polling and putting it into an analytical model. I think somebody back there called it predictive analytics. That's what we call it too. So we understanding, a predictive model on using, let's say, a voter file as a whole. When this message hits, where do we expect to lose ground? A poll is only going to be able to tell you a specific small sample demographic group, while the data is going to understand, oh wow, here is the exact voters that we will have problems with from utilizing the entire data file of when this hits, we're going to have a serious problem. So that's how the industry's really changed from, just over, from I would say from the past 10 to 15 years. I would say the most recent change is the understanding for data and the massive use of cell phone-only households. I mean, even just 6 years ago, I think the cell phone-only household percentage was 27 to 30, and just within 6 years, it's now half of the entire adult population. Sure. Yes, sir.
You've presented very sophisticated ways of analyzing things, but we still have the situation where polls seem to be off surprisingly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm thinking of, for example, the recent Canadian election that came as a surprise to everybody.
Yeah.
Why is that?
I don't know.
Do people lie to you? I mean, some people lie to you, but is that a major effort?
We're not worried about necessarily being lied to. I would say a couple of things. There is the media polls that are always off. So when you say a poll conducted by New York Times says X, and those polls are not done for internal value. There is nothing of value that poll has from a standpoint of what the campaign's numbers say and how we're utilizing it. The entire purpose of that poll is to be done at the least expensive possible to drive a news story. So they're going to use the cheapest means, the cheapest way to get a real poll. So, okay, we need the minimum availability of what we can pass off as a real poll at the cheapest possible cost, so the New York Times can say we conducted an independent poll to put it out. So it is extremely common that media polls are wrong as it relates to the top line. It's not that they're all wrong. I'm not suggesting that they're all wrong, but they're done so badly and so poorly, it's not unusual for them to be off. I mean, the way I always say it is campaigns let me put it this way. You should never make strategic decisions off polls you don't pay for. So if you see a campaign that's all about what the Washington Post poll says, and they're going to make a decision off that, you're doing it wrong. Those that you don't pay for, you don't make decisions off of. Now, as it relates to England, the UK, Canada, I don't know. I really don't. I mean, my understanding is their internal pollsters were off too. The situation in Newfoundland, the situation with England, and I gotta admit, I mean, those are competitors, so I can't go up to them and be like, "Why do you suck?" I mean, I could do that, but I don't know. Because they're not going to share their crappy data with me. I wish I've spent a year on trying to figure out why it is they're bad, because both Canada and England are not hard methodologically to do. So somebody is just doing some real garbage stuff over there. I don't even know. So, sorry I can't answer your question. I'd love to be able to figure it out, but they're never going to give me their garbage data for me to analyze. Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm.
We just heard a good presentation, a really amazing presentation this morning from two gentlemen at GNC.
Oh, yeah.
And did you hear it?
I did not.
Okay, well,
I bet they were really good.
Okay. One thing they stated was that their customer survey data, which would seem to be equivalent to polling data, is not nearly as accurate as the data they get in other ways.
That's right.
And so you place a heavy emphasis on polling. How would you respond to the question of maybe your data's not that good because polling isn't a great way to gather data, according to what I heard from GNC?
Depends on what it is. I would say, without hearing their presentation, because I only do about 50% of my side on the political and about 50% of my side on corporate market research and all the other things. A poll is not apples to apples. So the methodological style that we're using for a candidate for president is not what we're going to be using for Google. Into understanding what the difference. There's a different methodological means, and a good pollster is going to be able to change. From GNC's perspective on customer data, my assumption is that a traditional poll and what you would see like on an electorate would not be something that you would utilize. I'm sure they have some sort of database of customers, probably with an email. And that is, if they are going to conduct internal, what we'll call polling, utilizing the email address, that means they're doing it online. And it's a good, useful guide, but online polling is the absolute worst. It is not a random sample. Let's put it this way. As a professional public opinion researcher, we have to be certified by APOR. It's not as big a deal as like getting a bar license or anything, but we still have to have it. They will not certify online polls because they are the most consistently wrong. So it actually doesn't surprise me that they say their internal polling that they do with their customers is off, because online polls are always bad. It is a good, useful guide to understanding one or two big picture things, but it is also the worst in what you would make decisions off of.
Okay, I didn't want to imply that they said they used online polling for email. They used other methods of collecting data about their customers.
Oh, okay, yeah.
For example, they talked about they know when customers open their email.
Yep. To take a poll. Yep. Yeah, no, and that's good, and that's absolutely necessary. From an understanding of collecting a number of things off data, you're going to find out a lot more, basically a lot more variables about a particular customer or a customer base, not necessarily utilizing survey research. I mean, the survey research is going to be understanding what does the customer base segmented off by 4 of millions and millions of people, which pieces of information is going to make them buy more product. That's what you would utilize the survey research for. Their internal side is, I guarantee you they're doing it online. And that's okay. I mean, it's okay. I do a number of online surveys for companies like that, but I always have to warn them, okay, we need to take very big picture pieces off this just to understand kind of in a big picture snapshot what the base is. We start getting in deep in the weeds and we're risking some serious inaccuracies because of the online means. Yes, ma'am.
How do you address the difference between maybe what you see between the results that you get from survey data and observational data in the presentation? You know, we saw that people sometimes say they do something, but then they do something completely different.
That's right. Good question. That's the difference between what we saw quantitative and qualitative. So on the quantitative side, that's obviously the collection of the bigger picture polling, understanding all of the elements, and then the qualitative side. And that is where, the two, how do you merge the two? And the difference is you can talk to a voter via phone and understand, okay, there's 12 different messages and we want to take 1,000 people and understand what are the 3 of the 12. So we understand kind of the concept of the message. But a lot of times, the reasons we don't see it move or behave the way the poll says is because it was delivered improperly. So that is the means of where we need to take the quantitative side. Okay, we know the 2 or 3 main concepts that we know are going to work. But how do we deliver it? And that's in what we call a focus group. Those you can do online, and you can do them online. You can do them as a group setting like this with a lot less people. And you can look from a standpoint of, okay, we already know. We don't need you guys, that's not what we would say, but we know internally. We don't need them to tell us what message to use, but we need to be able to deliver this properly. Is it the candidate's wife is a good thing? Is it she's in a military outfit? Is it the kids, in a setting of flowers? Is it, the candidate's, pounding his fist like Donald Trump up here? I mean, that is the area of understanding how this message is delivered, because there's a ton of times where we know we're going to have a message that's impactful, but it's delivered the wrong way. And sometimes you just can't help it because the candidate sucks. No. Thanks. Appreciate it.